Now to continue with chapter 2, sexual reproduction. The initial thing required for this topic you've already done, that is the parts of a flower. I hope you know all the parts of the flower now very nicely. If not, just go through the video once more before you start this. Fine. So to continue, today we are going to learn about the details of the sexual reproduction now in plants, how the flower is important, how does it play a role in the sexual reproduction of a plant. Okay, so starting with, what are the mechanisms of sexual reproduction? What are the steps required that helps in finally getting a new plant? Reproduction means our objective is to get a new plant. Fine. So the mechanism involved, number one is pollination. So the first step that is required for us to know is pollination. Pollination is a process by which transfer of pollen grains take place from the anther to the stigma present in the pistil of a flower. So to recollect again, so if you take a bisexual flower, so what we learnt, the anther produces the pollen grain which carries the male gamete. Now this pollen grain is transferred from the anther to the stigma. Stigma is the part of pistil or gynoecium. So the pollen grain gets transferred from the anther, these yellow heads, bilobed structures inside which the pollen grains are present. So if you touch a fresh flower, I've told you, you'll get a yellowish powdery substance in your hand, or you can collect it on the paper and check out. Fine. So those pollen grains get transferred from the anther to the stigma. So this process is called pollination, and this is the process with which reproduction, sexual reproduction starts in a plant. Fine. After pollination takes place, that is the pollen grains are transferred, then comes the next step, that is fertilization. Fertilization is the fusion of the male and female gamete. Now, the male gamete in a flower is the pollen grains which carries the male gamete, and the female gamete is present inside the ovule. So when these two fuse, the male gamete and the female gamete, they fuse, the nuclear material come together, then that process is called fertilization. Now, after fertilization occurs, after the fusion of the male and the female gamete occurs, then comes the next step, that is formation of seeds and fruits. Once the fertilization has occurred, then the ovule changes or transforms into a seed, and the ovary changes into a fruit. So next, this mechanism that happens after fertilization is the formation of the seeds and the fruit. After the formation of the seeds and the fruit, what is necessary? Dispersal of seeds and fruit. Dispersal means spreading. So the seeds need to be spreaded. If all the seeds were to fall, to grow under the mother plant, then what would happen? There would be a competition for sunlight, for water, isn't it, for space, and half of them would not grow. So therefore, this process of dispersal, that is spreading of the seeds with the help of external agents like wind, water, even animals, even human being, okay, we help in the spreading of these fruits and seeds so that they get the optimum temperature, sunlight, water that is required for the seed to grow into a new plant. So after dispersal, the seeds germinate, that is, they grow into a new plant or a seedling. Small plantlet is formed which gradually, with the conditions that they need for their growth, if everything is fine, then they grow into a new plant. So therefore, by following these mechanisms, we get a new plant from a pre-existing plant. Okay, and now you know, because of the pollination, fertilization, in every process, the parts of the flower is important. Fine. So therefore, the flower is a very, very important part of a plant when reproduction is concerned. Now, starting with the details of the steps of mechanism of sexual reproduction in plants, that is pollination is the first step. So what is pollination? It is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Okay. Now this pollination is of two types. So what are the types now? The two types of pollination are self-pollination and cross-pollination. So the two types of pollination now we talk about is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now self means own. So in self-pollination, what happens? The transfer of pollen grain occurs within the flower, within the same flower. Okay, it can happen only in a bisexual flower where male and female both the parts are present. So here I have taken a bisexual flower. We studied this flower. So what happens if the pollen grains from the anther gets transferred to the stigma of the same flower? Then such type of pollination is called self-pollination. Fine. Now if the pollen grains get transferred with between the flowers on the same plant, okay, now the flowers of the same plant, if the transfer of pollen grains occurs from the anther to the stigma of another flower on the same plant, then this is also called self pollination. Okay. Cross-pollination. Cross-pollination occurs between flowers present, two different flowers present on two different plants, but it has to be of the same kind. Fine. That is called cross-pollination. I repeat, cross-pollination occurs between two flowers on two separate plants, but of the same kind. Right. Now this the question might arise in your mind that how will the flower choose, pick and choose? There are so many pollen grains must be floating in the air or coming into the flower by different means. So how does the flower come to know that which is its same kind of pollen grains? So what happens? Different pollen grains might come and fall on the flower, but only the pollen grains which are of the same kind, they pollinate the flower. Others, they disintegrate. Okay, some chemicals are given out by the stigma which destroys the other pollen grains. So it is important for you also to write in your definition same kind. Clear? Now we will discuss about the advantage and disadvantage of self-pollination and cross-pollination. So as it is clear in your mind what is self-pollination and what is cross-pollination, we can think about it and let's jot it down. So after knowing self-pollination and cross-pollination, let us compare both of them. Okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Starting with self-pollination. So let's discuss what are the advantages of self-pollination. So what happens in self-pollination? There are no external agents required. So as the pollen grains are getting transferred within the same flower or flowers of the same plant, so it does not need some external factor to help it in the transfer. Okay, so no external agent required. So this becomes one advantage of self-pollination. Okay, now for self-pollination, as because external agents are not required, so it need not produce a large number of pollen grains too. Okay, so large number of pollen grains not required. Okay, because wastage is minimum, so therefore pollen grains need not be produced in a large amount. Now, as because the pollination is occurring between the same flower or flowers of the same plant, so therefore purity of race is maintained. That is, the parent plant's characteristics will be maintained in the new plant that is going to be produced from the after pollination. Okay, so this is also an advantage. Purity of race is maintained. Okay, now talking about disadvantage. What are the disadvantages? That is, as because the self-pollination, the same flowers, pollen grains are getting fused, so therefore there is no mixture of characteristics. So therefore new varieties cannot be formed. So that is a disadvantage, isn't it? If there is a fusion of characteristics, there must be something better coming out, something new coming out. Okay, new varieties not produced. Now, because of that, what happens? The plants are not disease resistant. So, if any disease affects these plants, it can very easily spread, because all these plants, self-pollinated plants, are of the same type. Fine, there are no varieties in it. So, therefore, disease resistant plants are not produced. Okay. So, disease resistance is less. So this becomes a disadvantage. Fine. So in the advantage we can also write colored, scent. Nothing is required because it need not attract the insects for pollination. Okay, but it's a side point you may or may not mention. But now talking about cross-pollination. Now what we'll see, the advantages of self-pollination will become the disadvantage of cross-pollination. And the disadvantage of self-pollination now becomes the advantage of cross-pollination. Let's think. Okay, so what have we written? New varieties not produced. Now here what will happen? This is an advantage, as because flowers on different plants pollinate, so therefore there is a mixture of variety. So the advantage is new variety is produced. Okay, next, disease resistance is less, as because there are different varieties produced, so therefore disease resistance will be more. So disease resistance is more because of cross-pollination. Now talk about disadvantage of cross-pollination. Here no external agents are required. Here without external agent, pollination will not occur. So disadvantage, it depends on external agents. External agents required. Right? Next, large number of pollen grains not required. But here, as because pollination is dependent on external agents, so therefore a huge number of pollen grains are required, and there is also a lot of wastage of pollen grains. Okay, maybe the insect or the animal or the wind or the water carrying the pollen grains, it might, not deposit it in the right place. So there will be a lot of wastage too. So therefore, large amount of pollen grains required. So the amount of pollen produced in a cross-pollinated flower is also more. Okay, huge. Now next, purity of race. This is an advantage of self-pollination. So here, in disadvantage, purity of race will never be maintained. Why? Because pollination is occurring between flowers of different growing on different plants, but the kind is same, but still they are on different plants, so therefore there is a cross of their characteristics, so purity of race will not be maintained. Now next, as I told you, we can also talk about the color, the scent, the nectar, okay, which is not necessary in a self-pollinated flower. But here it has to be there. So the flowers need to be colored, needs to be bright, needs to produce nectar so that it can attract external agents for transfer of pollen grains. Okay, so now let us go into the details of cross-pollination. As we know now that for cross-pollination, external agents are required. So depending on which external agent, there are some particular characteristics that the flower bears or is seen in them. We will talk about that now. For the cross-pollination, okay, so there are external agents to start with. Let's talk about insect pollinated flower. Now what is an insect pollinated flower? It is a flower which is pollinated with the help of an insect. Okay, there are butterflies, moths, honeybees coming to visit the flower to collect nectar. When they come to visit the to collect nectar and sit on the flower, their body get brushed on to the parts of the flower. So what happens? The pollen grains get stuck to its body. Now when it flies and goes and visits another flower for the same purpose, those pollen grains get deposited on the stigma of the other flower. So in this way the insects help in pollination when it comes to collect nectar. Okay, now there are some particular properties of the flower that helps the flower to be pollinated by an insect. The first and foremost is its bright color. So you see that mostly the insect pollinated flowers are brightly colored. The petals are very brightly colored. The red, the yellow flowers, they attract the insects towards itself because of the color. Next, they have a fragrance, a scent. The scent of the flower, like rose, okay, also attracts the insects towards itself. Next, produces nectar. Okay, so they come to collect nectar. It acts like a food of the insect. So therefore, these insect pollinated flowers produce nectar. They have nectar producing glands near the ovary which produces nectar. The insect sits on the flower. It pierces its mouth parts like a needle into the flower and sucks the nectar from it. Okay, and coincidentally, the pollen grains also get brushed on its body, attaches on the hair on the body, and it helps in cross-pollinating the flower. Okay, it has a sticky stigma and sticky pollen grains. So what happens is because the stigma is sticky, so therefore when the insect goes and visits the next flower, the sticky stigma, the pollen grains get brushed on, the body gets brushed on the stigma, and as because the stigma is sticky, the pollen grains get stuck on it. Okay, and sticky pollen grains, even the pollen grains are sticky, so that it attaches itself to the body of the insect and does not get fall off. It doesn't fall off while it is flying from one flower to another flower. So therefore the sticky stigma and the sticky pollen grains help the flower in insect getting pollinated with the help of insect. Okay, now they also have very large and loosely attached anthers. So the anthers produce pollen grains. So the anthers are large and loosely attached. So how does this help? That is, the anther has the pollen grains in it. So if they are loosely attached and they are protruding out large, then what will happen? Very easily when the insect comes and sits on the flower, the anther, it will get in contact with the anther, and therefore the pollen grains will get deposited on its body. Okay, so this is how insect pollinated plants are helped with by its features. The examples are very, very important. The examples like sweet pea, orchids, buttercup, sunflower, marigold and salvia. These are flowers which are insect pollinated. Now there's a peculiar thing about insect pollinated flowers like lotus and trapa. They grow in water, isn't it? So they should be water pollinated, but it is not so. They are floating plants and therefore they are pollinated by insects. Okay. The other external agent that helps in pollination is wind. It is a major pollinating agent. So the flowers which are pollinated with the help of wind are called wind pollinated flowers. Now the characteristics of such flowers are that they are normally small flowers. The flowers are small, okay, because it did not attract other agents, so the wind can easily take away the pollen grains from it. They are dull colored because they do not need to attract the insects. The color will not be of any help to attract the wind. So therefore they are mainly dull colored or maybe white. Sometimes some flowers which are pollinated by insects which are nocturnal. That is, they are active at night. They are also white in color, but they have a fragrance or scent in them, which are pollinated by insects but are white in color. Now here the pollen grains are small, dry and light. It is very, very important that the pollen grains need to be small, it needs to be light, it needs to be dry, so that the wind while it is blowing can carry the pollen grains along with it. Okay. Now large number of pollen grains are produced. As because there will be a lot of wastage, the wind carrying the pollen grains may not be depositing it on the right flower. Okay, so therefore as because lot of wastage is there, so large amount of pollen grains are produced. Long anthers and long filaments. The anthers needs to be protruding out of the flower so that while the wind is blowing, it can take away the pollen grains from the anther. And the anthers to protrude out of the flower should have long filaments. So they have long filaments and long anthers protruding out of the flower so that the wind can take away the pollen grains with it. The feathery and large stigmas, how do they help? The stigmas, the carpel may be having 2, 3, style with feathery stigma it is seen in wheat, rice or maize very, prominently. So what happens? Because of the feathery and large stigma, the pollen grains which is being blown along with the wind can be, attached to the feathery stigma as the wind is passing by. Fine. So this helps the flower to be pollinated by wind. The examples of wind pollinated flowers are wheat, ryegrass, maize, rice. Okay. So now if you need to differentiate between insect pollinated flowers or wind pollinated flower or water pollinated flower, you just have to jot down these characteristics as a comparative chart. Agent, that is water. Now the plants which are pollinated with the help of water are called water pollinated plants, which are normally found in or around water. Now these plants have been observed that they have bear very small flowers. You know why? Because so that it can float in the water. So and travel and meet the male flower can come and meet the female flower, come in contact with the female flower. So therefore the flowers are small and light so that it can float for floating. Male and female flowers are borne on separate plants. So there is a pistillate plant which has the female flowers bearing only the gynoecium or the female part of a flower, and there are separate plants of the same kind bearing the staminate flowers, that is flowers which has only the male part, the female part is not there in it. Okay, it's an incomplete flower, so it has only the androecium in it. Fine. So now these male flowers, they detach from the parent plant, from the male plant, once it gains maturity. Now, as it is small, after it gets detached from the plant, it starts floating in the water. So while it is floating in the water, it comes and meets the female flower. The female flower has a long stem and it is there on the surface of the water. So when the male flowers, they come floating and meet the female flower, then the anther gets ruptured and the pollen grains are therefore deposited on the female flower, bringing about pollination. Now, because in this process a lot of pollen grains may be wasted, so a huge amount of pollen grains are produced in water pollinated plants. The best example is Vallisneria. So the example, Vallisneria. Okay, now after pollination occurs, okay, the female flower, the stem again coils and the flower goes under the water. It is no more floating in the surface of the water after it is pollinated. Okay, so this is how water helps in pollination of a. Now, due to the rapid increasing of population, so there we faced, the scientists had a challenging task to perform. That is, the cultivable land could not be increased. So it is actually decreasing day by day, because of the concrete jungle coming up. But so the scientists need to find out a way so that the production can be increased from the same amount of plants, number of plants growing. So if there were hundreds of plants, hundred of plants, say 100 plants were growing in a small plot of land, the amount of produce from that 100 plant, the scientists needed to increase. They couldn't increase the number of plant, but they could increase the amount of produce per hectare or per plant. So the a way of producing such high yielding plants was artificial pollination. That is the same transfer of pollen grains being done, but with the help of man. So till now you were whatever you learned were natural processes, but this is an artificial process to gain more produce from the same number of plants. Artificial pollination or hybridization. Now this process has a few steps in which we get the target produce that we need to. Number one, first selection. The plants are selected which needs to be, the characters needs to be mixed. Maybe one plant which has very good, quality of produce, and another plant the same kind of produce, but the yield is more, but the quality or the taste is not that good. So we select two plants with desired characteristics which need to be pollinated artificially. This is the first step, selection. After selecting the plants, then the step 2 is emasculation. Emasculation means removal of the male part, the stamen. Suppose the plants that we have chosen are bisexual, then we need to do this step. That is, the anther from one of the plant's flower is removed. Okay, so as it is bisexual and the anther is removed, or the stamen is removed, the male part is removed, so therefore the flower will be left only with the female part. Now, after emasculation, removal of the stamen, comes pollination. Now this pollination is done by man, that is from the desired plant that we have chosen. Now from the other plant we will take some pollen grains and deposit in the flower which has been emasculated manually. Fine. After this transfer of pollen grain is done manually, then comes bagging. That is the flower, the emasculated flower which has been pollinated, now is covered with a plastic bag. Now because of this, what happens? Why is it necessary to cover it with a plastic bag? Because so that the other pollen grains that are there around the flower do not pollinate it. Fine, and then the whole purpose will be lost. So it is bagged or put in a polythene. Okay, and kept for few days. After the pollination occurs, fertilization occurs, we get the seeds. Those seeds have mixed characteristics of these two desired plants and are called hybrid seeds. Now these hybrid seeds, that is seeds having mixed characteristics, these hybrid seeds when sown and their plants are grown from these seeds, and these plants when they will give their fruits, then we might get a variety of plant which will have high yielding produce or better quality of seeds as per our desire. Okay. After pollination, the next mechanism that is important for sexual reproduction is fertilization. So fertilization is the union or fusion of male and female gametes. Actually, the nuclei of these special reproductive cells called gametes fuse. Okay, so now the male gamete of flower is the pollen grain. The ovule inside the ovary is the female gamete. The pollen grain has a double wall structure, and inside it there are actually two nuclei. One is generative nucleus, another is tube nucleus. Fine. When the pollen grains reaches the flower, it has already reached this stage of having two nuclei, and further changes occur only if the pollen grain reach the stigma of its own species. Okay, so once it reaches the stigma of the own species, then further changes occur. Now talking about the ovule, that is the female gamete. Now the ovule has two protective layers called integuments. Then it has a mass of cells which is nutritive. Then inside it there is a embryo sac, okay, that holds the baby plant later on. The embryo sac. Inside the embryo sac, actually there are 7 cells. The integuments, okay, leave a small space. That space is called micropyle. Fine. So here in the embryo sac, there are 3 cells towards the micropyle and 3 cells just opposite to it. Okay. Now the 3 cells towards the micropyle, out of them, the central cell is the egg cell or the ovum. Okay. The 7th cell is the central cell, which has 2 polar nuclei. I repeat, the embryo sac has 7 cells, 3 towards the micropyle, 3 on the opposite side, and 1 central cell. This one central cell has actually 2 nuclei. Okay. Now out of the 3 micropylar cell, the central cell is the egg cell, or having the ovum or the egg cell. Fine. Now coming to the process of fertilization. When the pollen grain reaches the stigma of its own kind or own species, then what happens? The stigma starts producing some secretion, some sugar, which helps the pollen grain to take the further changes. Now all the pollen grains which are there on the stigma starts then producing a tube-like structure. But out of them, only one pollen grain can produce the tube, which keeps extending. Okay. Now this pollen tube has, if you remember, 2 nuclei. Tube nucleus and generative nucleus. Out of them, the tube nucleus helps this pollen tube to reach the micropyle. So it keeps on dissolving any tissue coming on the way by producing enzymes, chemicals, okay, and leads the pollen tube towards the micropyle. Once it reaches the micropyle, the tube nucleus degenerates, gets destroyed. Fine. The generative nucleus divides into 2 male gamete nuclei called the sperm nuclei. So actually the tube nucleus, the pollen tube had 3 nuclei, isn't it? The tube nucleus and generative nucleus divided into 2 male gamete nuclei, out of which the tube nucleus degenerates when it reaches. Now the male gamete nuclei enters the embryo sac through the micropyle, and when it reaches the embryo sac, the pollen tube ruptures and the male gametes are liberated inside. Out of the 2 male gametes, one of them fuses with the egg cell. Out of the 2 male gamete nuclei, one of them fuses with the egg cell. The other nuclei, male gamete nuclei, moves in towards the polar nuclei and fuses with it. So if you can imagine what happened, there are 1, 2 and the male gamete nuclei. So triple fusion occurring here, 3 nuclei fusing together. Okay. Now here the egg cell or the ovum, the central cell towards the micropyle, fuses with the male gamete nuclei to form zygote. Okay, zygote is the first cell of life, the first fertilized cell, and the other male gamete fuses with the polar nuclei to form the endospermic nuclei, which provides nutrition to the growing seed. As two male gamete nuclei fuses, this process is also called double fertilization. After the fertilization is completed, now further changes occur. That is, the ovary swells up, it ripens and develops into the fruit. The ovule changes into the seed. The other parts, that is the calyx, the corolla, the stamen, they dry and they fall off. The ovary only remains attached to the plant with the stalk. The ovule, only single ovule may be fertilized to give rise to a single seeded fruit, or multiple ovules may be fertilized to give a multi-seeded or many-seeded fruit.